I swear it's not what you think, my wife said when I saw the messages pop up late at night. I didn't argue. I filed for divorce quietly. Now she's explaining everything in court while I sit there completely unbothered. I swear it's not what you think. That's what she said. Not, hey, you're awake. Not, I didn't hear you come downstairs. Not even the basic instinct of pretending nothing was happening, which honestly would have bought her more time. Just that one sentence. Preloaded. Sitting there behind her teeth, like she'd been keeping it warm, waiting for the right moment to release it. Like she'd rehearsed it. I stood there in the hallway, barefoot on cold tile, looking at her. She was on the couch with her phone in both hands, a message preview glowing at the top of the screen. The living room was dark except for that light. She was looking at me with those wide, careful eyes. I didn't say anything. Because here's the thing most people know on some level but don't like to say out loud. That sentence only ever gets said when it is exactly what you think. Nobody who just got caught watching a guilty pleasure reality show says, I swear it's not what you think. Nobody who was texting their mother at 1:30 in the morning says that. You only reach for that sentence when the thing in front of you is precisely the problem it looks like, and you need a few seconds to buy yourself room. I nodded once, said nothing, turned around, and walked back up the stairs. Got into bed, lay there in the dark with both eyes open, staring at a ceiling I couldn't see. And I made a decision in about 90 seconds that I did not move away from once in the months that followed. I didn't know it yet, not fully, but that moment changed everything. What people don't understand, when they hear a story like this, is how much I had to lose. Not just a marriage on paper, not just an asset to divide or a ceremony to unmake. We had built something. 7 years of something. I had a daughter who still slept with the night light on, who needed me to check under her bed, not because she actually believed anything was there, but because the checking itself was the point. The ritual was the safety. I had a Sunday morning routine, coffee, quiet, newspaper, the particular kind of slow morning that feels like it belongs only to you. A life I had chosen. A life I had kept choosing every single day, even on the hard ones. And now, lying in the dark at 1:30 in the morning, I could feel the shape of all of it changing. Like when the pressure drops before a storm. You can't point to it. You can't name the exact thing your body is responding to. You just know. Something irreversible was coming. I didn't sleep again that night. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. I was 36. We'd been married for 7 years, together for 9 total. We lived in a decent house in a quiet suburb, the kind of neighborhood where people wave from driveways, where someone always notices when you get a new car, where the same dog is always loose on Saturday mornings. That's the full backdrop. You don't need more than that. Her name was Claudette. And for most of our marriage, and I mean this genuinely, without revision, I would have told you she was the most straightforward person I'd ever been close to. She had this habit of explaining herself, not in an anxious way, in an almost philosophical way, like she believed strongly in the value of being understood. If she spent money on something unnecessary, she'd walk me through the entire reasoning chain before I could even react. If she changed her mind about plans, she'd give you the full context. If she was upset about something, she'd tell you exactly which part upset her and why. I used to tease her about it. You know, you don't have to justify every decision to me, I'd say. She'd just shrug and smile. I just like being transparent. Funny. That's genuinely funny, in hindsight. Not the laughing kind. The other kind. We met through a mutual friend at a birthday party. She was standing near the food table when I walked over, and she laughed at something I said before I'd even gotten to the actual punchline. Like she'd already mapped the joke's trajectory and wanted to reward the effort in advance. I remember thinking that was either a wonderful sign or a terrifying one. For 9 years, I told myself it was wonderful. The first time I noticed something was wrong, I almost talked myself out of it immediately. It was small. I know I keep saying that, but it's true. It starts small. It always starts small. She began placing her phone face down. I know how that sounds. A lot of people put their phones face down. I'm not an idiot. I know that in isolation that means nothing. But Claudette had never done it before. Not once. She left her phone everywhere, always face up. On the kitchen counter, on the rim of the bathtub while she had a bath, sitting open on the coffee table while we watched TV together. She was not protective of it. It was just a phone. Then one day, quietly, face down. I noticed. I said nothing. Then she started taking it to the bathroom. Not just occasionally. Every time. That specific, deliberate reach for it before she left any room. I noticed. I said nothing. A month after that, She started getting up in the middle of the night. I'm a light sleeper, always have been, and I'd wake at 2 or 3 a.m. and find the other side of the bed empty and cold. Not cold like she'd just gotten up, cold like she'd been gone a while. I'd lie there and hear nothing for a moment, and then, if I stayed still long enough, I'd see the faint gray light seeping under the bottom of the bedroom door from somewhere further down the hall. Phone light. Specific, unmistakable quality to it. I noticed. I said nothing, but I started paying attention in the way that a quiet, patient person pays attention, completely, and without revealing it. People have a misconception about how these things unfold. They expect there's always a moment. The dramatic catch. The irrefutable proof delivered in one clean scene. That's not how it works. What actually happens is the slow erosion. The 1,000 tiny absences that accumulate until one day you realize you haven't actually felt truly met by this person in months. Maybe longer. Claudette started being physically present but spiritually absent. That's the only honest way to describe it. She'd be sitting on the same couch as me, close enough to touch, and I'd look at her and feel the strange, disorienting sense of looking at a duplicate. Like the real version of her was elsewhere, engaged in a whole other conversation. And what was sitting next to me was a very convincing stand-in running on autopilot. We stopped having our Sunday mornings. The first week she said she was exhausted and wanted to sleep in. Fine, no issue. Second week, she said she had some things she needed to catch up on. Third week, I made coffee for one and sat at the table alone and didn't set her mug out. She didn't comment on it. And that specific absence of noticing, told me more than anything she could have said. I need to be clear about something before I go further, because I think it matters for understanding why I handled everything the way I did. I am not a reactive person. I don't catastrophize. I don't go through people's belongings. I don't make accusations before I have something solid to stand on. And I don't confront someone in a moment of emotion when I know the conversation will go nowhere except in circles. I learned this through experience, some of it my parents, some of it my own early mistakes, and I hold it as a genuine value rather than a flaw. The most dangerous thing you can do in a marriage that's starting to show cracks is react before you understand. Because reaction hands the other person the power to shape the narrative. They get to choose what they admit. They get to choose what they deny. They get to respond to your emotion with their own emotion. And suddenly the actual truth of the situation gets completely buried under both people's hurt and defensiveness. No, that's not how I was going to operate. So I watched, and I waited, and I thought, and I assembled. About 5 months before that night in the hallway, I had a conversation with my brother Felix that I keep coming back to. We were at his place watching a football match, beers out, not talking about much. At some point, I don't even know what triggered it. He just turned to look at me with that specific expression he gets when he's about to say something he's been sitting on. "You doing all right?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Why?" He shrugged, but the shrug was doing a lot of work. "I don't know. You just seem far away these days. Every time I talk to you, you're present, but you're somewhere else at the same time." I sat with that for a moment. "Things at home feel a bit off," I said finally. "Not more than that." He nodded. Didn't push. Just let it sit there between us for a minute, the way Felix always does. "Trust your gut," he said eventually. "Yours has always been better than you give it credit for. And if it's telling you something, don't let yourself ignore it too long." I drove home that night, turning the phrase over in my mind. Don't ignore it too long. The question I couldn't answer was, how long was too long? November, early in the month. A Tuesday night. Our daughter Nora was at my mother-in-law's for the week, half-term school break, arranged weeks in advance, totally routine. The house had that particular quality of quiet that only exists when Nora is away. A specific texture of silence. Her absence is a physical thing. It changes the atmospheric pressure of a room. I'd gone up to bed around 10. Claudette said she'd be up soon. She wanted to finish an episode of something she'd been watching. I fell asleep. Woke up sometime around 1:30. Reached over. Cold sheets. I lay there a moment with my eyes open in the dark, just breathing. Then I got up, went to the bathroom, and on the way back to bed, I stopped at the top of the stairs. That gray light. Under the living room door. That specific phone screen quality of gray that doesn't look like any other kind of light in a house. I went downstairs. Not sneaking. I wasn't trying to catch anyone. I was just walking downstairs, the same way I'd walked down those stairs 100 times before, completely normally, the way a person moves through their own house. I opened the door. She was on the couch, phone in both hands, slightly hunched forward, the way people hold their bodies when they're reading something private. And then, At the exact moment I stepped into the room, a message preview appeared at the top of her screen. I didn't get to read the whole thing, but I got enough. A name, a small heart emoji, and the first 2 words of a sentence that started with, "I miss." That's all. 2 words. She looked up at me. I looked at her, and she said it. "I swear it's not what you think." I nodded once, walked back upstairs, got into bed, and lay there in the dark, completely still, completely calm in the eerie way that a person can be calm when they've already, on some level, been preparing for the thing that just happened. The decision came fast. It wasn't even a decision in the usual sense. It was more like the completion of a process that had been running quietly in the background for months. Like a calculation that finally returned its result. I was not going to confront her tonight. I was not going to ask questions she would dodge or give her an opening to perform remorse on the spot. I was going to do this correctly, methodically, on my own terms. I stared at the ceiling until it got light outside. The next morning was one of the stranger experiences of my life, and I've had a few. She came downstairs and made coffee. Her usual rotation, the specific brand she orders online. She asked if I wanted toast. I said yes. She put bread in the toaster. We talked about the neighbor's renovation. The drilling had been unbearable for 3 weeks, and there was apparently no end in sight. She had thoughts about it. I responded to her thoughts. It was completely, utterly normal, and she seemed lighter. I noticed it. She had this slight loosening around her shoulders, a subtle ease in how she moved around the kitchen. She thought the 4 words had handled it. She believed that "I swear it's not what you think" was a complete sentence that had closed a door. And I sat across from her, eating toast, and thought, she has no idea what I'm about to do. I called a lawyer 3 days later. Her name was Diane. She'd been recommended by a friend of a friend, someone who'd gone through a contested custody situation and described Diane as the calmest, most effective person he'd ever seen in a legal proceeding. When he said calm, he meant it as the highest compliment. I sat in her office on a Thursday afternoon and laid everything out. The behavioral changes, the timeline, the gradual accumulations, not because the specifics of who he was changed anything, but because I'd been in a room with him. I'd made conversation with him. And the entire time, there had been this whole other context I'd known nothing about. I didn't know yet how long it had been going on. I was about to find out that the answer was more than I'd prepared myself for. Living in that house for 2 months while all of this was running quietly underneath everything was, without question, the most surreal extended experience of my life. I cooked dinner. I helped Nora with her reading homework. I watched TV in the evenings. I went to her school play. I remember this specifically, and I sat in a row of folding chairs in the school gymnasium and held Claudette's hand in the dark while Nora stood on stage in a cardboard crown, absolutely rigid with the effort of remembering her lines. I clapped. I laughed at the right moment. I leaned over to Claudette and said, "She's great," and Claudette smiled and squeezed my hand. I held that hand. I smiled. And underneath all of it, I was somewhere else entirely. I was already gone. I just hadn't left yet. The thing that made the waiting genuinely hard, the only thing, was Nora. Not the marriage. Not the betrayal, which I'd already processed to some significant degree just by virtue of the months of gradual suspicion preceding it. It was my daughter's life, which was about to change in ways she didn't see coming and couldn't have been prepared for, because she was 6 years old and her whole world was still contained in that house. That was the weight I was carrying. About 3 weeks into this period, Claudette made a move. She came home one evening with flowers. Proper ones, from an actual florist, not the grocery store wrapped in plastic kind. She put them in the blue ceramic vase we keep on the dining table without mentioning them or asking me to notice. Just arranged them and walked away. Later that evening, she came and sat close to me on the couch. Very close. Close in the deliberate way, not the casual way. "I feel like we've been so distant from each other lately," she said quietly. Claudette, who that night had told me she was at her friend Bev's birthday dinner. I heard all of this from Felix, and then I pulled up the shared family calendar, the one Claudette maintained for school schedules and activities and family commitments. Bev's birthday was marked on it. It was marked for the 31st of October. The photo Felix had seen was from the 14th. I sat with that information for about 30 seconds. Then I called Diane. I called her first thing the next morning. Actually, let's be accurate. I sat in my car in the work parking lot before going in, and I called her and said 2 words, "It's time." She said, "Come in this afternoon. Bring everything you've noted." I'm going to move through the next part quickly, not because it wasn't significant, but because the legal mechanics of what Diane and her team put together aren't what this story is really about. What matters is the evening, I told Claudette. I chose a Saturday. Deliberately. Nora was at my mother's for the weekend. I had arranged that 2 weeks in advance, casually, the way you casually arrange things when you're actually arranging something else entirely underneath. Claudette had made pasta for dinner. One of the 40 or 50 meals she rotated through, something with a cream sauce that she'd been making since we first started dating. We ate at the table. She talked about a situation at work, a colleague who had mishandled something and caused a small cascade of inconvenience. I asked the natural follow-up questions. I was present. I waited until she finished eating. I cleared my plate and put it in the sink, and when I came back to the table, I placed a single document face up in front of her and sat down. She looked at it. Then she looked at me. "What is this?" "Divorce petition," I said. The color left her face in a way I hadn't expected. Not the dramatic draining you see performed in films. Just a quiet, genuine blanching. Like her body had understood it a fraction of a second before her mind did. "What are you? Why are you?" She stopped. Tried again. "This is because of one night? Because you saw a message?" "Claudette." My voice was completely level. "I have been working on this for 2 months. I have a lawyer. I have documentation. And I have considerably more information than you're currently aware of." The silence that followed was very complete. I watched the different responses move across her face. The instinct to deny. The calculation of what I might know versus what I might be bluffing about. The anger, it came briefly, a flash of it, before she controlled it. And then the tears. Genuine tears, I think. Not performed. "Can we just talk?" she said. Can we please sit down and talk about this before you?" "There will be time to talk," I said. "Through the appropriate process." I picked up my keys, put on my jacket, and I walked out of the house. I sat in the driveway for 20 minutes. Not wavering. I want to be clear about that. Not reconsidering. Just sitting with it. Because even when you've been preparing for something for weeks, even when every clear-headed, rational part of you knows this is the right thing, the only thing, the thing you would choose again if you had to choose it 100 more times, grief doesn't wait for your timing. It has its own schedule, and those 20 minutes belong to it. I let it do what it needed to do, and then I put the car in reverse and drove to Felix's. He poured 2 glasses of something good, sat across from me at his kitchen table. Didn't ask much. "You okay?" he said. "Getting there," I said. He nodded. We sat in that kitchen until well past midnight, talking about things that had nothing to do with any of this. Football. Some renovation he was thinking about doing on his spare room. A book he'd been meaning to read for 2 years. The ordinary fabric of a life, laid out around this enormous thing like insulation. By the time I drove home, to Felix's spare room, which he'd already made up without me asking, I was something close to steady. The months that followed were, predictably, complicated. Claudette cycled through the phases that people cycle through. First, the version of events she offered her friends and family. That I was overreacting, that I had misinterpreted something minor, that the marriage had been perfectly functional and I had made a rash decision. This version circulated for a few weeks among people who knew us both and created some awkward conversations I'll spare you the details of. Then the negotiation phase. A request for couples counseling, conveyed through text. A proposal for a formal separation period rather than divorce. Could we try mediation? Could we try something? The word she kept using was talk. Could we just talk? Diane had advised me that I could engage with any of this through legal channels. I did not need to engage with it personally. I didn't. Then the anger phase. A handful of late-night texts that I screenshotted and forwarded to Diane without reading twice. Nothing extreme, but enough that it was useful to have documented. And then, underneath all of that, a different kind of message would come through occasionally. Not manipulative, not angled, just sad. The kind of thing that made clear she had arrived, at some point, at the full weight of what had happened. I didn't respond to those either. Not because I was made of stone. Because I knew, by then, that responding to anything would be gasoline. That the kindest thing I could offer, to her, to myself, to the process we were both locked into, was consistency. Here is the thing I learned during the discovery process that I had not known when I filed. I mentioned earlier that I didn't know how long it had been going on. The answer, when it came out, through statements, through partial message records, through what Claudette's own counsel eventually could not avoid disclosing, was close to 3 years. 3 years. Not 3 months. Not a single reckless incident that spiraled. 3 years. Which meant it had started before we bought the house we were now dividing. before Nora had started school, before a family trip to Portugal that I remember with complete, uncomplicated warmth. Just the three of us, Nora discovering the ocean for the first time, Claudette and I sitting on a terrace in the evening while Nora slept inside. Before probably 4 or 5 other moments I could name if I wanted to, all of which now had a second layer underneath them. When that information arrived, I expected rage. What I actually felt was something more like the final settling of a building that had been shifting on its foundation for months. Everything made sense. The years of distance I'd sensed and couldn't name. The over-transparency about small things that had served as cover for the enormous thing going unspoken. The specific way she'd never quite been entirely present in the room with me. I had always attributed it to personality, to the natural distance that exists between any two people over time. Now I understood it differently. She hadn't lost herself inside our marriage. She had never been entirely inside it. I sat in Diane's office when this came out, and I was very still for a long moment, and Diane, who is not a warm person in the conventional sense, but is remarkably perceptive, just let me sit there. Then I said, "Okay." She said, "Take whatever time you need." I said, "I'm fine. What do we do next?" She looked at me for a second, and something shifted slightly in her expression. Not pity. I wouldn't have tolerated that, and she knew it. More like a professional acknowledgement of something. "You sure?" she said. "I've been processing this for 8 months in one form or another," I told her. "This is just the last piece arriving. I'm not surprised. I'm finished." She nodded and moved to the next thing. "But I'll be honest with you. I drove home from that meeting, and I sat in a car park for about 45 minutes. Not thinking exactly. Not crying. Just existing in the specific suspended stillness that comes when the last piece of something clicks into place, and the whole structure of a thing, something you thought you understood, something you built your life inside, turns out to have been a different shape all along. 45 minutes. Then I drove to pick up Nora from school, and she ran toward me across the playground with her backpack bouncing and her coat half off one shoulder, already shouting something about what had happened in art class. And I crouched down, and she crashed into me, and I held on to her for slightly longer than usual. She didn't notice. She was already talking about the art project. I was glad for that. There was a week, about 5 weeks into the waiting period, where I came dangerously close to saying something. Not because I'd broken, not because the patience had run out, but because of something Nora said at dinner. We were all three at the table. Chicken. Some kind of roasted vegetable thing that had been in my rotation for years. Nora was doing the thing she does where she eats in a very specific order, proteins first, then everything else, always. And at some point she looked up and said, completely out of nowhere, "Mummy, why do you always look at your phone at bedtime?" The table went quiet. Claudette looked up from her plate. "I don't always," she said, with this very careful, very even tone. "You do," Nora said, matter-of-factly, with the devastating specificity of a 6-year-old who has logged something. "Every night. I hear it buzzing when you think I'm asleep." Claudette smiled, this tight, controlled smile, and said something about work messages in different time zones, and Nora accepted this explanation because she was 6 and hadn't yet learned to interrogate the logic of adults. But I sat there at my end of the table and I held my fork and I looked at my plate and I felt, for the first time in 5 weeks, the cold edge of something that wasn't grief or determination or planning. It was fury. Pure, clean, quiet fury. Not at Claudette. Not exactly. At the waste of it. At the specific, petty, careless waste of allowing our child to hear buzzing through a wall at night and file it away in her 6-year-old mind as a thing that happens. I breathed through it. I asked Nora about her day. The fury went back where it lived. But I called Diane the next morning and told her to move as quickly as she possibly could. There was also, somewhere in those weeks, a moment I'm less proud of. I want to include it because I've been honest about everything else. About 6 weeks in, I was alone in the house on a Wednesday afternoon, Claudette at work, Nora at an after-school activity. I was in the kitchen. Her phone was sitting on the counter, face down. I looked at it for a solid 30 seconds. Then I made a cup of tea, went to the other side of the kitchen, and stood with my back to it until the kettle finished. I didn't touch it. Not because I was worried about what I'd find. I was past caring about that. But because there was something I decided early in this process that I was going to stay on the right side of, legally, personally, morally. Some line I wasn't willing to cross just to confirm something I already knew. It's easy to maintain your principles when maintaining them costs you nothing. It's a different thing when the answer you want is sitting face down on the kitchen counter and the house is empty. I drank my tea on the other side of the room. I was proud of that later, in a quiet way. I need to say something here about Nora, because she matters more than any of this, and she's been threaded through this whole story without getting the space she deserves. Through all of this, the months of quiet building, the filing, the separation, the proceedings, she remained the clearest, most grounding thing in my life. Not because she understood what was happening. She didn't, not fully. But because the act of being her father demanded something of me that nothing else did. It demanded that I remain present. Not checked out. Not emotionally elsewhere. Present, warm, consistent, the same person she'd always known. Whatever was happening in the legal architecture of our family's restructuring, Nora's experience of me had to remain stable. That was non-negotiable. It also meant, practically, that I couldn't afford to fall apart. And I genuinely think, that being her father is a significant part of the reason I handled this as steadily as I did. Not because I'm some kind of stoic, but because she gave me something to organize myself around when everything else was in motion. A north point, a reason to stay calibrated. Kids are remarkable in that way. They ask so little and demand so much, entirely without knowing it. We handled telling her carefully, jointly. Actually, Claudette and I sat with her together, because we had both agreed that whatever had broken between us was not going to be allowed to contaminate how we functioned as her parents. That meeting, the one thing we did together during this whole process, was harder than anything in any courtroom. Nora listened with that focused, very still quality that children sometimes have when they know something important is happening, even if they can't fully map it. She asked if Daddy and Mummy were sad. I said, sometimes a little, but not at each other, and not because of her. She thought about that. Then she went back to her cartoon. Kids are remarkable. They build around change in ways that adults forget how to do. Court day. People imagine something explosive. I think we all have some version of a legal drama in our heads where there's cross-examination and someone cracks and the truth comes out in a single gasping moment. Ours was a Tuesday morning. It was gray outside, the particular low gray of a late autumn English morning that doesn't decide whether to rain or not. I had decent coffee from the small cafe in the building's lobby. I wore a blue jacket that Nora had told me was her favorite. I sat in the gallery and listened to Claudette's attorney present her client's narrative of the marriage. It was a careful narrative. It involved phrases like communication difficulties and emotional unavailability and a pattern of withdrawal. The emotional withdrawal being attributed was largely mine. I sat there. I did not react. I held on my face the exact same neutral expression that I had held on the couch the night she rested her head on my shoulder and asked if we could do a weekend away together. The same expression I had held at 100 dinners, at the school play, at every ordinary moment across 2 months of living inside a life I'd already made my decision about. Present. Still. Unbothered. Because by Tuesday morning, there was nothing left to be surprised by or hurt by or defensive about. I had processed every version of this. Every reframing, every attempted narrative, every way the story could be spun. I had been through it alone, in the dark, for months. What Claudette's attorney was presenting was the performance version of events. Diane had the documents. The documents came out in the way documents do, not dramatically, but steadily. The calendar discrepancy Felix had spotted. The partial message records that Discovery had surfaced. A financial record that showed a hotel booking for a weekend when I'd been at a professional conference alone. A conference I'd gone to alone because Claudette had said she couldn't get away that weekend. Diane doesn't present things dramatically. That's not her style. She presents them the way you place tiles in a row, one after another, each one adjacent to the last, until the picture they form is obvious to everyone in the room, and there is no alternative interpretation available. It's more effective than drama. It's considerably more difficult to argue against. There was one moment in those proceedings that I think about more than any other. Claudette was being asked a direct question about the timeline, about the nature and duration of her involvement with Owen. And she paused. It was a fraction of a second too long. The kind of pause that happens when someone is making a calculation in real time. And in that pause, her eyes moved. They moved to me. Just for a second. Just a fraction. And I understood what she was looking for. She was looking for a reaction, something to read, some evidence that this was landing, that it was hurting, that I was still invested enough in the outcome to be visibly affected by it, some signal that I was still reachable. I held her gaze for exactly 1 second. Then I looked back down at the notepad in front of me. Nothing. No signal returned. No wound offered. I think, in the end, that was more disorienting for her than anything Diane had put in front of the court that day. We settled. The terms were fair and thorough. Diane had done her job well, and the documentation had done its job well, and what we arrived at was a clean, workable arrangement. Nora is primarily with me. Claudette has generous, consistent time and access, more than adequate, in accordance with what Nora needs and what is fair. We have agreed, formally and informally, to maintain a functional co-parenting relationship. She is Nora's mother. That is not a conditional or a temporary fact. It is permanent. And I made peace with that, with the version of Claudette who gets to remain in my life as a co-parent, before the paperwork was signed. Because the alternative, carrying hostility into the space our daughter occupies, was never an option I was willing to take. Whatever Claudette did in our marriage is categorically separate from who she is to Nora. Those are two different compartments, and I keep them apart. After everything was finalized, I took Nora for the weekend to a house Felix rents occasionally by the coast. Just the two of us. She spent most of the first day running at the edge of the water fully dressed, shrieking at the cold, determined to touch the waves and retreat before they could reach her shoes. She ate an enormous amount of chips. She fell asleep in the car on the way back to the rental, and I carried her inside, and I stood in the small bedroom doorway watching her sleep for longer than I probably needed to. There is nothing in the world like that. The specific peace of a sleeping child who feels safe. I went and sat on the front step with a cup of tea and looked out at nothing in particular, and I felt, for the first time in what seemed like a very long time, genuinely, completely still. Not empty, not sad, specifically, though there was still some of that around the edges. Just still. The way you feel when you've been carrying something heavy for a long time and finally you've set it down, and your body is still adjusting to the absence of the weight, and the world is just quiet. I had coffee with Felix about 3 weeks after that coastal weekend. We went to a place near his office. Sat outside, even though it was cold enough to need jackets. He's always been an outdoor table person when there's an option, regardless of the temperature. I've never fully understood it. He'd been carrying something. I could tell as soon as I sat down. Felix gets a kind of was it worth it, he asked. The way you handled it. The whole, quiet process. Do you think it was right? I thought about it properly before answering. I think it was the only way I could have done it, and still been able to look at myself clearly, I said. That's not exactly what I asked. I know. I took a sip of my coffee. Yeah, it was worth it. Not because it was satisfying in some revenge sense, but because at the end of it I had the truth, and I'd handled it with some kind of dignity. Those two things matter to me. Felix nodded. She called me, he said then. I looked at him. Once. About 6 weeks ago. Wanted to know if I blamed her, I think. Or maybe she wanted someone to tell her that what happened wasn't entirely her fault. He paused. I was polite. I didn't have much to say. What did you say? I said I hoped she'd work out how to be a good mother to Nora from here. That was it. I sat with that. That's the right thing, I said. That's actually all that matters now. He picked up his coffee. I know. We sat outside in the cold for another hour, talking about nothing important, the way you do when important things have been said and there's nothing left to add. We were in the kitchen on a Saturday morning. She was eating the specific brand of yogurt that has been her singular obsession since she was 4, which I now stockpile because I have learned not to risk running out. She was completely absorbed in it, using the small spoon she prefers, doing the little things she does where she eats in a neat spiral from the outside in. She looked up. Daddy, why is our house different from Mummy's house now? I had thought about how I'd answer this question for months. I'd turned over 100 versions of it. I'd talked to Felix about it, and to a child psychologist friend Diane recommended. Because families can look different ways, I said. Some families live all in one house. Some live in 2. Both can be good. She processed this with the focused seriousness she brings to important information. Are you sad about it? Sometimes a little bit, I said. But not in a way that doesn't get better. She thought about that. Okay, she said. Then she went back to her yogurt spiral. And I stood at the kitchen counter in my house, Nora's house, and felt something so uncomplicated it took me a second to place it. Just ordinary. Just mine. Just this. The specific kind of quiet that a life makes when it finally belongs entirely to itself again. That night in the hallway, barefoot on cold tile. That gray phone light. And her voice, preloaded, rehearsed, delivered before I'd said a word. I swear it's not what you think. She was right about one thing, in the end. It wasn't what I thought. It was worse. But by the time she was explaining it in court, carefully, thoroughly, With the help of a lawyer and months to prepare, I already knew all of it. She explained everything. I already knew everything. That's the difference between being first and being thorough. She was first. I was thorough, and I sat there, completely unbothered.